I remember that day as if it were yesterday, not because it was particularly dramatic or a turning point, but because it was the quintessential representation of hundreds of other days just like it. Days when you exist on the edge, when every step is a struggle and every little thing is a test. It was raining, not just an autumn shower that rustles softly through the leaves, but a real downpour, cold, piercing, as if the sky too was weeping with me. It seemed like the vast, unseen force had decided to pour all its sorrow and anger onto the world. And I felt like the sky was crying with me, crying over my fate, over my helplessness. I stood near the bus stop, huddled under a tiny, rusted shelter that barely offered protection from the water. In the pocket of my old, faded coat, I had just a few coins left. Enough for one bus ticket or for a packet of the cheapest rice. The choice was small. On my feet, I wore shoes. They were once black leather. Once. Now they were faded, scuffed, and the sole on the right shoe had come off almost completely. Every step in those shoes was a challenge. In winter, they let in the cold and snow. In spring and autumn, mud and water. And even now, in this downpour, water was trickling down my feet, chilling my skin, soaking my socks, leaving a wet, unpleasant trail. Along with the water running down my legs and dripping from my hair, it felt like the last crumbs of my dignity were also being washed away. You stand there, soaked to the bone, with empty pockets, in shoes that no longer serve their purpose, and you feel worthless. You feel like a burden, like a mistake. My home was a rundown room in a dormitory. It wasn't a home in the warm, cozy sense of the word. It was just shelter. A room for 4 girls, always noisy, cramped, and never truly clean. The walls of those rooms, it seemed, were soaked with the smells of other people's lives, broken dreams, fatigue, and hopelessness. They were witnesses to quiet tears and loud arguments, sleepless nights, and attempts to study amidst roommates' loud music. My life was divided into 2 parts. At night, I cleaned floors. A night shift job at one of the city's large shopping malls. When the stores closed, we came, an army of invisible cleaners. With buckets, mops, cleaning supplies. Hours alone with the loud whirring of floor polishers and the smell of chemicals. I worked from dusk till dawn, utterly exhausted, with pain in my back and hands. This job provided minimal earnings, just enough to afford a bunk in the dorm and not starve. But it took all my energy. During the day, I tried to make it to my college classes. I enrolled because I believed that education was the only bridge that could take me to the other side of life. But combining a night job with studying was incredibly difficult. In class, I often fell asleep, swaying with fatigue. My brain refused to absorb information. I was physically present, but my thoughts wandered somewhere far away, between the mop, the bucket, and the desire to just lie down and sleep forever. I often felt deficient. Not physically, my body protested, ached, demanded rest. Not emotionally, my soul was empty, parched, unable to feel anything but chronic fatigue and a dull ache from the realization of my situation. I saw other students socializing, going to parties, living what seemed to me a full life. I was separated from them by an invisible wall of poverty and exhaustion. People walked past me, not noticing, on the street, on public transport, even in the college hallways. I was like a shadow, like a feature of the landscape, like an old, shabby pole or a puddle on the asphalt. Something you don't look at, something that exists on the periphery of someone's attention. It was painful, but I got used to it. Invisibility became my defense. My family was ordinary, very ordinary. Simple working-class people from a small town in rural Michigan. Their whole lives were hard labor from start to finish just to afford the bare necessities. They were tired. Tired of life, of the lack of prospects, disheartened. They gave me everything they could, their love, their modest warmth, their belief that things would be better for me out there, in the city. But this everything was never enough for me to feel safe or secure. Their help was a drop in the ocean of my needs. I learned to survive early on. Not just live, but truly survive. Counting every penny, denying myself everything, cooking the simplest meals from the cheapest ingredients, walking instead of taking transport to save money, sleeping only a few hours a night. It became my second nature, an instinct. But even on the worst evenings, when the cold penetrated to my bones and hunger twisted my stomach, when it seemed that I had no strength left and never would, I dreamed. I dreamed loudly, fiercely, passionately, as if defying the whole world that seemed determined to crush me. I dreamed of a different life, of warmth, of light, of the chance to breathe deeply, of being noticed, of my voice being heard. It wasn't just a dream, it was an internal protest, an engine that prevented me from finally breaking. Even in my Holey shoes, standing under the rain, I looked into a future that I believed had to be different. It was one of those ordinary, endlessly long days. After a night shift, after a few hours of sleep in the noisy dorm room, I came to my morning class. My body ached from fatigue, my eyes were heavy. I sat at the back desk, hoping to remain unnoticed and perhaps catch a few minutes of sleep. The lecturer, Professor Thompson, was giving a lecture on literature. She was an older woman with wise, kind eyes and a voice that seemed to wrap you in warmth. She had seen many students over her years of work. She had seen those eager for knowledge and those just sitting through classes. I tried to take notes, but the words of the lecture mixed in my head with thoughts of fatigue, of bills of my leaky shoes. My hand automatically wrote letters, but it wasn't a transcript. It was thoughts. My own, unfiltered thoughts pouring onto the paper. Thoughts filled with the pain of my powerlessness, the burning desire for change, and an unclear but strong urge to break free. It was a mix of a diary, a complaint, and fragments of dreams. I wrote about the feeling of being invisible, about how hard it was to breathe under the weight of poverty, about dreams that seemed impossible. I poured out onto the paper all the bitterness and hope that boiled inside, not thinking about form, about style, just words, words, words. Professor Thompson finished her lecture a little early and started walking between the rows, explaining something to individual students. I sat hunched over my notebook, trying to hide what I was writing. And then she came up to my desk. Quietly. I didn't even hear her footsteps. She stopped next to me and looked down at my notebook. My heart stopped. For a moment, I wanted to cover it with my hand, but it was too late. She read. A few seconds of silence that felt like an eternity. I didn't dare to lift my head. I felt myself blushing. Shame. Shame for my chaotic, overly personal thoughts poured onto paper. Then she slowly looked up. I finally met her gaze. Her eyes. They had changed. There was no reproach or surprise in them. There was something deep. Understanding? Recognition? This, she said softly, pointing a finger at my notebook. This is real. I didn't understand. Real? What exactly? My suffering? My awkward words? She looked me directly in the eyes, and there wasn't a hint of pity or sympathy in her gaze, only a certain firmness and belief. You should write, she added. Write? I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. A laugh that escaped my chest along with all the fatigue, pain, and cynicism that had accumulated over the years. Who am I? Professor Thompson. I'm a cleaner. I scrub floors at night, barely make it to class during the day. I don't even have money for decent shoes. What kind of writer am I, for God's sake? My voice sounded sharp, maybe even defiant. It was a defense against the fragile hope that might arise from her words. It was easier to deny, to dismiss. Professor Thompson didn't react to my tone. She just looked at me with the same calm, piercing gaze. It doesn't matter what you do now, she said. What matters is what's inside you. And you have a voice. And you have something to say. Write. About yourself. About what you feel. Not for notes. For yourself. And perhaps for the world. She placed her hand on my notebook. Don't lose this. It's your gift. Even if right now it's in shoes with holes. After those words, she quietly walked away to other students. I sat stunned. Her words were etched in my memory. This is real. You should write. I walked home after class, and the rain no longer felt so oppressive. Her words echoed in my head, even if right now it's in shoes with holes. She saw not a cleaner, not a tired student in the back row. She saw something else. Something I didn't see in myself, or was afraid to see. That night, as always, I came home from work utterly exhausted. My body ached, my head was spinning. But instead of immediately collapsing onto the bed, I opened my old, battered laptop. I had bought it used for next to nothing a while ago. I opened a blank document. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. What to write about? She said, about yourself. About what you feel. And I started writing, not for a grade, not for publication, for myself. I poured out everything that had accumulated inside, about the pain, about the loneliness, about the anger at the world's unfairness, about my clumsy dreams, about the leaky shoes, about the fatigue that felt eternal, about the people who walked by, and about the burning desire, that unclear, fierce desire to live differently. I wrote about myself, but I felt like I was writing about many, about all of us, about those who are trying to survive, who are fighting against circumstances, who lack opportunities, but have a dream that aches, about broken dreams that still breathe beneath the wreckage of reality. The words flowed on their own. It was a stream of consciousness, a flood of emotions. I wrote until morning, until I passed out from exhaustion right at my desk. It wasn't just a story. It was a liberation. The first real step on a path that began in shoes with holes. And this step wasn't taken with my feet, but with words. After that night with the laptop, my life gained a new dimension. The fatigue didn't disappear, poverty didn't retreat, but something else emerged, a purpose that burned inside. I continued to clean floors, attend classes, survive. But now I had a secret. My nights were no longer just a time for exhausting labor. They became a time for creativity, a time for building. I started writing regularly. After the night shift, when the dorm was either asleep or just waking up, I would sit down at my laptop. I wrote about everything I saw and felt, about the tired faces on buses, about the empty gazes of people in the mall, about my childhood memories, about injustice, about the small joys that sometimes happened. I wrote as I breathed. It was a necessity. When I had collected a few texts, I started thinking, what next? Professor Thompson said, for the world. But how could the world hear me, a girl with holy shoes and a dorm address? I began searching for opportunities. I sent my texts everywhere I could think of. To local newspapers, online magazines, some literary contests I heard about from classmates. I didn't know the rules of the game, had no connections, didn't understand how the world of media or publishing worked. I just looked for email addresses and clicked send. With every email sent, a tiny, cautious hope would appear. They rejected me dozens of times. Standard, cold letters. Your text doesn't fit our format. Unfortunately, we cannot publish it. Thank you for your interest. I received hundreds of them. Or simply, silence. That silence was worse than rejection. It was like that very feeling of invisibility I lived with every day. As if your words, your thoughts, your story were worth nothing. As if you didn't exist. There were moments when I wanted to give up. When fatigue and disappointment won. When I thought, maybe Professor Thompson was wrong. Maybe this isn't a gift, but just an illusion. Maybe I should focus on more real things, like how to find a second job to finally buy decent shoes. But something inside wouldn't let me surrender. That same fierce dream. That same internal protest. I remembered Professor Thompson's words, "You are not broken. You should write." And I wrote. I wrote despite the rejections, despite the fatigue, despite the holy shoes. And then, one day, when I had almost despaired, a reply came that changed everything. It was an email from a small online blog that published social stories. Their letter wasn't standard. It was short, but warm. Hello. Your text about shoes and rain moved us to tears. We would like to publish it. Would you like to write more for us? I reread that email probably 20 times. Moved us. My words. My story. Moved someone. It was incredible. And then I read the last sentence. For publication, we can offer a small fee. $25. $25. It wasn't a large sum even then. But for me, it was wealth. It was validation. Validation that my work, my words had value. That I was being seen. That my voice had been heard. I cried. I sat in my rundown dorm room with the laptop on my lap and cried. I cried from relief, from joy, from gratitude. They were tears that washed away years of pain and despair. I felt as if after a long dive, I had finally surfaced and taken a full breath. I said yes, of course. And I wrote more. And more. The blog became my first platform. My texts started being read, commented on. People wrote to me saying their stories were similar, that my words resonated with them. It gave me incredible strength. From then on, I lived between two worlds, two realities. Nights for writing. Time for creativity. Time for building my new world. Days for work, still cleaning floors, but already looking for other opportunities, and studying. It was a frantic pace that was exhausting. The friends I had gradually forgot about me. I couldn't go for walks with them, to the movies, or just sit in a cafe. Every free minute was dedicated either to work, or writing, or trying to catch up on my studies. My social life vanished. But I wasn't angry. I knew what I was heading towards. Every post, every line published, it was like a brick in my new home. A home I was building for myself, brick by brick. I learned. I learned not just in college. I learned to write. I learned to understand people. I learned to analyze information. I devoured knowledge greedily, like oxygen after a long dive. I knew that knowledge was also a building tool, and that I had to use every chance to get it. This was the first real step. Difficult, exhausting, but a step forward. The path in Holey shoes was just beginning. 3 years. Only 3 years had passed since the day when $25 for my text seemed like unbelievable wealth. 3 years of frantic work, sleepless nights, constant fatigue, battling despair. But they were 3 years of continuous movement forward. Step by step, brick by brick. I no longer cleaned floors at night. After my texts began to gain popularity online, I found work as a copywriter, then an editor at a small online publication. This provided a more stable income and, most importantly, allowed me to develop in the right direction. I finished college, albeit remotely, but I got my diploma. My spark, the desire to write, had turned into a real flame. I didn't just write my own stories. I wrote about social problems, about people who were struggling, about injustice. My texts resonated. They were shared, discussed. My voice, which had once been a barely audible whisper in the dark, now rang out louder and louder. I created my own online resource, a small website where I published my articles and gave a voice to other people with difficult fates. The resource quickly gained popularity, transforming from one person's blog into a real platform. And so, 3 years later, I was already running a small but influential media company that had grown from that website. I had a team of like-minded individuals who believed in the same values as I did. We wrote about things that truly mattered, helped people get a voice, changed something in society. I had an apartment. Not a dorm room with 4 beds and strange smells. My own, small, but so dear apartment. With silence. With warmth. With a window overlooking the sky, not the wall of a neighboring building. It was an incredible feeling of security and stability. And most importantly, my mother. She could finally just live. I was able to help her financially so she didn't have to work herself to exhaustion, so she had time for herself, for rest. Seeing her smile, knowing that she wasn't tired and disheartened, was the greatest reward for me. It was one of the most important bricks in my new home. My phone, which once was silent or only received standard rejections, now rang off the hook. My inbox, hundreds of unread emails, requests for interviews from major TV channels and magazines, invitations to speak at national forums and conferences. I, the girl who cleaned floors at night and wore Holey shoes, was now invited as an expert, as an example of success, as an inspiration. For the first time, I stood on a big stage. The lights blinded my eyes. Hundreds of people sat in the audience, looking at me. I wore nice clothes, comfortable, whole shoes. But a voice echoed in my head, "You are that same girl in shoes where the soul gave up long ago." I smiled at the thought. Yes, that was me. I told my story. I told about rock bottom, about the rain, about the shoes, about the dorm, about the fatigue, about the first $25, about the hundreds of rejections. I told about the spark, about the path, about the struggle. I told about how to survive when it feels like everything is against you, when every day is a fight, and hope seems like an illusion. I told about how to find your voice and not be afraid to use it. After the speech, people came up to me. They shook my hand, thanked me, shared their own stories. There were especially many young women. Young, with tired eyes, but with a spark of hope that ignited after my words. They said, "I see myself in you." They believed because they saw a living example. They saw that it was possible. It was incredibly moving. I started a foundation. I named it symbolically Spark of Hope, because I remembered every step I took, every hungry day, every sleepless night, every moment of despair. The foundation helped young women from low-income families get an education, find jobs, receive mentorship. We gave them not just financial aid, but what was most important for me at the beginning, belief in themselves. Belief that they could do it. The girls who received scholarships from the foundation, who found their first jobs, who believed in their own strength, thanked me. Seeing their smiles, their first successes, it was another confirmation that my path had meaning. Every morning, looking in the mirror, I saw more than just myself. I saw the path, every step, every painful rung I had climbed. I saw the fatigue from the first part, the spark from the second, the determination from the third, and this rise from the fourth. I saw the girl in the Holey shoes and the woman standing before you now. And I knew they were one and the same person. A person who never gave up. I thought a lot about my path, about what made it possible. And I understood the main thing. Poverty is not in your pocket. It's in your heart. When you give up. When you let your hands drop. When you stop believing in yourself and your dreams. When you let circumstances break you. My pocket was often empty, but in my heart, a spark always burned that no downpour could extinguish. I wasn't special. I didn't have any unique talents, initial capital, or influential connections. My family couldn't help me with anything except moral support. I was one in a million, but I never stopped. When I got a rejection, I looked for another door. When I fell from exhaustion, I got up and kept going. When I heard no, I looked for a way to say yes. My story is not about incredible luck or gifts of fate. It's about choice. The choice to fight. The choice to believe. The choice to act. Every day. Even when it seems impossible. If you are in darkness now, whether from poverty, from disappointment, from despair, or from life circumstances that seem insurmountable, remember, this is not the end. This can be the beginning. The beginning of your path. A path to light, to fulfillment, to a different life. Remember me. The girl in the Holey shoes who cleaned floors and slept only a few hours a night. The girl the world didn't notice, but who refused to give up. I am proof. Proof that a path exists. A path from rock bottom to the top. A path from pain to strength. A path from invisibility to a voice that thousands hear. And this path can truly begin in shoes with holes. My life now is not a fairy tale. It's constant work, responsibility, new challenges. But it's a life filled with meaning. I see how my efforts bear fruit, how my foundation helps others, how my words inspire. I continue to write, now not at night after cleaning, but in my own office, but with the same passion and sincerity. I write about those who are still walking in shoes with holes, and I believe in every single one of them. My story concluded as a tale of success, but it is not finished. It continues every day, in every new project, in every act of help, in every girl who found a spark of hope within herself. The path continues, and I walk along it, remembering every step I've taken and knowing that the main thing is to never stop. Even when the soul gives up and the sky weeps in a downpour. The most important conclusion I drew: external circumstances can be incredibly difficult. They can cause pain and despair, but they do not define you completely. What defines you is your inner strength, your ability to dream despite everything, your readiness to fight and move forward. No matter what. My shoes had holes, but my spirit, never. And that is what allowed me to walk my path. I look at my reflection and see a woman who has achieved a lot. But I will never forget the little girl who stood under the rain. She is a part of me, a part of my strength, and a reminder of where I came from and why I do what I do. And if you are reading this and things are tough for you right now, know this: you are not alone. And your path is also possible. Find your spark, hold on to it, and walk. Keep walking forward. Even if your shoes have holes,